The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, we are really excited for today's session on developing design systems at scale with our guest speaker, Peach Hotchkiss, who is the head of UI and UX at C. Now, before we begin the session, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, please fire them over via the chat box, and Pete will answer them at the end of the session. We are recording this session, and this will be made available by email. Now, I'm going to hand over to Pete to kick us off. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, and thanks for jumping online, everyone. And for those of you listening back to this recording a little bit later, here's a hello from the past. In today's session, I want to share a little bit about how we've been building our design system here at C. It's approaching 2 years into its integration. It's now relatively mature, but it's been a less than smooth road to get to the point where we currently are. And I wanted to share some of the lessons we've learned, the mistakes we've made, because I believe and I hope it's going to be beneficial to you guys as the wider design community. I like to look at our design system as it stands right now as a little bit of a young adult, beginning to make its way out into the wider world, having passed through a period of some tantrums and adolescence along the way. If some of our screw-ups can save you and your team's time, money, and stress, then I'm happy to take that one for the team. Just a little bit of an introduction about myself, just quickly before I jump on kind of too much. As Harriet said, I head up the UI and UX team here at C. And I've been working in the digital design field for in excess of 20 years now, both in the product space and in advertising. So yeah, unfortunately, I have a little bit of a shameful history of working on all those annoying and intrusive ads that pop up over your Yahoo mail. But I'm hoping you forgive me that particular misdemeanor. If it any way grants me any forgiveness, I am partially responsible for helping launch TV shows and films like Games of Thrones here in the UK. And back until I sold my agency a few years ago, I had a long-standing list of entertainment clients on my roster. Working within the design constraints and guidelines of tightly controlled properties as we did, it's afforded me an interesting perspective and experience to bring to the development of visual vocabularies that form an integral part of any design system. As I said, things have changed though, and these days I head up the design team here at Clarksons, or C, and lovingly known as the Crayon Crew, as it were. And we're working on a suite of products that service the marine and commodities trading industry. This is a 150-year-old business operating one of the oldest industries in the world, but it's an industry that's beginning to face significant outside disruption from the technology sector, and in much the same way the finance sector did a decade ago. The pressures to conform to regulatory and compliant processes mean much is changing in this sector. This is a sector which is undergoing a true digital transformation. The suite of tools that I mentioned a moment ago are formed from over a dozen applications targeted towards different sectors of the industry. So, for example, we have an application which takes vessel tracking and positional data and allows our brokers and traders to monitor in real time where these ships are at any given point. We also have tools that perform hugely complex journey calculations down to the level where we can forecast total voyage costs impacted by predicted air temperatures and the impact this has on the salinity of water. Yes, water can literally get thicker, albeit by a small amount, but enough to add several $1,000s into fuel consumption costs. When I joined, all of these existing applications were at various levels of maturity. They use different tech stacks and have been implemented with a variety of front-end technologies, where Google Materials, Bootstrap, etc., etc. There was very little to no continuity across the board. Seal's parent company, Clarksons, had a vision to unify all of these products into a single cohesive ecosystem, an operating system for the marine industry. Part of this undertaking required a complete overhaul of the application's front ends. We're now approaching 3 years into the first phase of this digital transformation, and an integral part of change has been the development of a design system and the wider vocabulary and approach that has been needed for this system to be successful. It's something of an immutable truth in the current design zeitgeist that design systems are a hot topic. Everyone seems to want one. What with design and the wider design thinking, playing an ever-increasing role in the development cycles of products and applications. I'm sure I could fill a 30-minute session alone on the benefits they bring, and I suspect the majority of you dialed in today are familiar with them and their purposes. But for those that are perhaps here because they're curious to even learn what they are, the simplest summary I can give them is to paraphrase what many consider to be the Bible of our sector, the Design System Handbook. It states, a design system unites product teams around a common visual language, reducing design debt, accelerating processes, and bridging feature and implementation gaps between teams who are collaborating to build products to life. In simple terms, their entire existence is to aid development teams with the creation of applications that look and behave in a uniform way. Whilst the core feature set of an application could be at polar opposites to their capabilities, it won't be uncommon for users to dip in and out of multiple products. So a familiar interface and behaviors are key. Nobody should have to relearn functionality from app to app. Consider Microsoft Office, for example. Word, Excel, and PowerPoint all do fundamentally very different tasks, yet features such as opening a new file work in exactly the same way. This is a design system in action, and it's just this sort of vocabulary and feature set we wanted to see products to have. Like any sensible start to undertaking a project, getting a perspective on what the lie of the land is a smart place to start. Auditing what the state of play was with existing production applications, modules in development, and projects in the pipeline gave us a picture of the task at hand. What became clear, and I mentioned this very briefly earlier, was consistency was almost non-existent, and developing a system that was unopinionated about which technologies it integrated with was going to be paramount. From a front-end framework perspective, teams were using Angular, React, and Aurelia. The first two of those, many of you will be familiar with. The third one, probably not. And these teams were expanding rapidly, which meant onboarding new engineering resources was often a priority. Let's put aside the challenges of formulating a consistent design aesthetic for these applications. It was quickly apparent it didn't matter how pretty the visual elements we would be producing were. Actually getting this system into the applications as seamlessly as possible was going to be our biggest challenge. We needed the experience for engineers tasked with actually integrating the system at the coalface of products to be as seamless as possible. So our first attempt. Looking back now, at the core of why our first attempt at implementing a solution failed is we got the team model wrong, really wrong. We are led with assigning one single point of ownership, an overlord, if you like, who ruled the design system. Whilst there were visual designers contributing to the aesthetic, a single solitary front-end engineer was responsible for the creation, development, and ongoing maintenance of the code that surfaced to teams looking to implement the styling. When you couple that with the fact that the engineer was also working as part of one of the product teams, the cracks began to appear. Now, anyone who has put together will tell you to avoid single points of failure as much as you can. Overlords, no matter how talented they may be, as designers or engineers, are a single point of failure, which hard as they try, simply don't scale. And they really don't scale when you have a dozen teams all looking to that individual for guidance. It's very difficult for this rockstar slash ninja slash unicorn developer, or whatever the kind of trendy term is for these people these days, to produce anything when they're spending half their time fielding questions from other engineers as to, oh, what's the design pattern for our boxes on mobile devices? Or perhaps, what's the class name again for disabled buttons? What color is the green in our design here? And that's before you even consider addressing bugs that invariably rise when the code is being rolled out at such a speed. If you're creating a design system for smaller teams focused on simpler implementations like microsites, then the solitary model like this could work for you. But for anything approaching an enterprise requirement, this is going to need a different approach to ownership, something which we'll cover in a bit. Speaking to the engineering leads on the products, their major concern with having the responsibility of implementing any system came down to one very simple requirement, which was portrayed in numerous conversations, such as, it needs to be just like Bootstrap. I just want to import one thing and then it just be really easy. Our build pipeline is already really complex. We can't have it bringing in a million other dependencies. Keep it simple, right? So, as a first pass, we engineered a Bootstrap-style CSS framework, which applications in theory would just import. Technically, they could do this. But the reality of using such a framework once imported was fraught with friction. The style CSS that was generated was bloated, like kind of 300 kilobytes bloated. So it was having a detrimental effect on the performance of applications and the speed at which they loaded. Many of the applications which we're building here are trading platforms, so occupying bandwidth with needless display-only code was suboptimal and risked having a detrimental effect on the dollar revenues that we're able to generate. This model of a one-size-fits-all meant for easy management of our styles from a design team, but it was doing so at the detriment of products when it came to actual implementations. This style structure, whilst engineered elegantly in terms of how the definitions for elements on screen were structured, how the cascade and the inheritance of visual elements worked and came together, they were great, but it was overly aggressively opinionated in terms of how teams needed to structure their HTML or their DOM, as they would sometimes reference it. It meant that teams working on if teams working on apps didn't structure things exactly how the design system expected it, things began to break. This is an annoyance for new applications in development. But for legacy apps, retrospectively addressing these issues was becoming an impossible task. And then there was the added complexity that documentation for this framework was thin at best, and that's being polite. The reality was documentation was almost non-existent. The understanding of knowledge to really implement this framework the way the designs intended sat in the head of just one individual. Our single point of failure again. Not great, and certainly not practical. For anyone involved with software development, we know that documenting anything is hard. And it's almost always the last thing to really get addressed within any development cycle. With this first pass of our design system not having it, it really kicked us where it hurt, and it was something we needed to address. We were essentially asking the engineering teams to build out an entire suite of flat pack furniture with little to no instruction. In trying vainly to create the products through design, we were making an already difficult life for teams impossible. And then there was the bridge between designs and the teams tasked with implementing them. We'd invested heavily in the time to create a dynamic library of symbols in Sketch, but bridging the gap between these static and flat prototypes and the actual engineering implementations was problematic. Prototypes seen by stakeholders within the business were beautiful, but there was no language in place to describe these designs in a manner in which engineering could easily implement and maintain the consistency. The inspect style features in platforms like InVision or UXPin were great in principle, but at scale, we found that this just led to inconsistencies with colors, spacing, and other visual tenets. This manufactured itself in the end product, not always reminiscing the versions which business stakeholders and product owners had indeed signed off on. This bridge is a space filled by a methodology and approach the community has largely termed as design ops. My feeling is that this concept is perhaps outside the scope of today's webinar, and it's a vast subject area on its own, but it was something we clearly needed to address in our design system. Otherwise, we would not be able to meet expectations. So how do we hit reset? As an expansion within the product teams continued, to kind of give you some idea of the scale at which we as a business were growing, the engineering team had originally been around 20, and within a year we were well over 100 front-end developers, full-stack developers, QA testers, BAs, etc. So the team had grown rapidly, and it was obvious that the existing cracks in our mechanisms weren't sustainable, and something was going to go bang very quickly if we didn't change. In an attempt to create design simplicity, we've done the opposite. It's time to admit defeat, regroup, and come back from a different angle. Much of what we had in terms of the aesthetic for the design system was solid. We had a good library of patterns and behaviors and processes, which not just the design team were now familiar with, but other product stakeholders like BAs, etc., were beginning to become intimate with. The problem was not conceptual. It was that the owners of the design system had not done a good enough job of packaging the system up in a way that was making a difference that it needed to on the actual products. If there was to be any hope of adoption by the teams, we needed to ensure that the next iteration of the system made it easy to adopt. We went back to the drawing board, we started doing our research and went around the engineering teams, and two key mistakes stood out. This bootstrap style CSS styling was far too opinionated, and teams didn't need to feel constructed or constrained by its demands of how to work. They wanted to implement structure in the way that best suited their applications. Teams were also beginning to adopt a more advanced application development techniques, and with web components and the like appearing, requests for the design system to expose a visual DNA of the design system and in various formats began to surface. Teams naturally also wanted and were demanding documentation. Asking the design team on an individual level was great for social interaction. You know, those responsible would try to respond on Slack and email as quickly as possible, but that's not practical at scale. We developed a custom font set exposed as icon fonts and SVG as a means to replace the previously overused font awesome system. This was heavily documented and easy for teams to access, and quite rightly engineering teams were questioning as to why the same couldn't exist for the design system. The approach we then took was to expand ownership of the design system from a single individual point of failure to something more collaborative. Whilst there is now still a centralized team, albeit now larger than one, who has overall responsibility, contributions are federated out to other teams from other products who all contribute ideas and implementations to the core code base. Further, the team committed to make documentation an integral part of everything. Everything exposed publicly for consumers of the design system to be used would be heavily documented. Whilst it was acknowledged this is an additional overhead to development timelines, making it part of the acceptance criteria for features being added to the system would mean the end product was infinitely more usable for engineering teams. On a practical level, there are several ways in which this can be implemented. And for you guys and your teams, you would potentially need to research and find the best suited for your development life cycles. But we landed on a solution that would essentially take inline comments within the code base of the design system and generate a static website that could be referred to as documentation by other engineers within the various teams. This was happening automatically. So you document as you go. Much more appetizing from a development perspective than having to retrospectively go back and do it in bulk further down the line. For those of you perhaps interested in some of the specifics here, we're using a combination of a tool called SAS Docs and a custom template, which is based on a node script generating handlebars templates. And without diving too much into the code here and boring those who are less interested in this too much, essentially this is a way of the developers responsible for generating this code to put instructions and put clues within the code base, and a static reference or documentation style website is generated as part of the build and release process. All this aside, we still did, however, have the question of just how teams could make use of the design system in the way they needed to. I made mention earlier at the start of some of the modules and the applications we have within the C platform. These are using, as I said, a combination of Angular, React, Aurelia, and some of them even just kind of vanilla JavaScript. So a typical approach with reusable components would be complex, and an undertaking which, excuse me, and an undertaking which the general feeling was the business wasn't mature enough to embrace. It was much better for the teams to work with whatever elements and components they felt best for their products, and then to provide them with the ability to dress the UI with visual definitions that the designs demanded. Essentially, this comes down to allowing the teams to continue to work the way they wanted to. Many of our applications across the C platform are interconnected, with data and information shared across them. For example, CNET, which is the vessel tracking application I mentioned, is used by a number of other applications to identify key bits of information. For example, the distance between two ports, and perhaps how long it's going to take for a typical vessel to complete that journey. This feature is exposed by way of an API, or essentially an interface through which one application is able to query another, ask a question, and simply ask something like, how long will it take for this ship here to travel from Rotterdam to Singapore? CNET, when it's asked this, returns the result in a format that the consuming application understands. It's stripped of all content, it's stripped of all structure other than the raw data. It occurred to us then that the rules and guidelines around the design system aren't really that different to an API. And APIs are a paradigm that engineers are more than familiar with. So what if we explode the rules of our design system as an API that applications could probe for an answer? What if there was something that can answer our questions? A little bit like a librarian. What if we said, what if the question was going to be, what's the hex value for this button? What's the font size for our headings? How quickly should a panel that slides in from the left move? If we could create a way to easily answer these questions via means of this API, we might be onto something. Exposing all of these core properties in a way that means they could then be integrated into an application in whatever way best suited the application's own build pipelines could reduce the pain points and friction within the teams. So we stripped all opinion and rules around how something must be structured and just left the key information, the visual cues. The important that stuff defined what the pixels in the applications should actually look like. The stuff that, as visual people, matter to us. So our design system, Mark II, if you like, works as follows. It's still a dependency in any project. Teams need to import this in. And there's a little bit of work up front for them to integrate it into their build pipelines. But it's a very, very simple inclusion of one line of code. And again, for those who are kind of less fussed about the technical side of things, I don't want to dwell too much on what is going on here. But essentially, this is just a way of saying, here's where to find the rules. And it's through that interface that we're able to obtain the information that we need. Perhaps it's visual properties like colors, maybe font sizes, maybe the size of padding and margins around particular elements. All of these are exposed as shorthand variables, if you like. that semantically describe how they should be used. So it's not about exactly what the hex or the RGB value of a color is, or at least not in a way that the engineering teams need to worry about. It's about the context. If the designs call for an action button that has a background color, the engineers simply have to use the color which is described for what it is. So they will simply define the background color as the action color. As a design team, we control what this language is. And by defining such a design vocabulary, it's much easier for the engineering teams to become familiar with and integrate. Again, they don't need to worry exactly what complex color values are. The moment they see an element in a design that is red, they know that's our warning color, and they can label and assign the colors as such. This API and the design system does the heavy lifting of replacing that label with the appropriate color value. As I said, I wanted to avoid diving too much into the matrix of ones and zeros on this today. And as I suspect you as an audience might have a complete appetite for a live coding session. But for those of you that maybe want to explore this a little bit more, I've got my contact details at the end, so please feel free to reach out on an email or LinkedIn. As a team, we are also looking to open source the code behind this process at some point this year, likely to be Q2 or Q3. It's not specifically about our design system and our styles, but more the framework, how this can be integrated into any project. As I realize I'm moving towards the end here and occupied a lot of your time, I'd like to draw things towards a little bit of a conclusion and some tips for any of you looking at beginning to implement the design system where you are. Start with a design language and not interface. And by that I mean it's about more than just the pixels and what things look like on the screen. From our perspective, no brand existed for our products before we really started work on this, and we could look to evolve that as part of the wider system and vernacular. Tip 2, recognize as quickly as possible if you're heading off piste. It's very easy to think the best way to solve problems is to push through, but I think this is a great example here of where kind of moving fast and breaking things does work. We realized pretty quickly that our first pass wasn't working, so we had to change. Bake documentation into the core. If you really want your teams to implement your design systems, you need to make it super easy for them to be able to access all of the information and all the possible implementations that you are likely to have. Thank you. Towards the end there. We can cover off any questions that we may have. Harriet, I think you're going to kind of raise any that may have been brought into the chat. But for those of you that want to reach out or have any specific questions, I've got my contact details there for you.
Oh, thanks, Pete. That was absolutely excellent. We have got questions coming in. The first one, okay. Why did the mistakes happen? What were the contributing factors?
I think from our perspective, a major contributing factor was the speed at which we were trying to run. You know, there was rapid expansion of the teams in terms of manpower and the head count. As I mentioned, we kind of over the period of about 18 months, we grew from 20 to in excess of 120 odd. And the pressure to deliver the products that we were working on meant that at times, corners were cut. I think as well, as part of the wider kind of transformation that's going on here, as a business, design thinking and a design approach to projects was very, very new. And therefore, as well as trying to evolve and develop these systems, there's a level of education you're having to do to the wider business as to why we may want to approach things in a slightly different way. I hope that answers that question.
Yep, so we've just got one coming in saying, can we see an example of your patterns and system? I'm not sure if you'll be able to do that on the webinar.
Yes, I mean, look, that might be something which I'm happy to share offline a bit. I think given that this is going to be recorded and put out, I think for now I'm happy to share it kind of, offline with people, kind of in, either via email or something like that. And as I say, we are going to be open sourcing this, but I mean, for want of a better phrase, if I just pop back a couple of slides to what we kind of have there, the slide I have on screen there, like any interface, we have a series of buttons in our design system which are coloured in different ways to implement or suggest different outcomes. And in the example you see there, there's a kind of nice looking red button in the centre of the screen. In the context of our system, red buttons are very often attached to kind of quite destructive processes. So deleting a file or stopping a particular process that may well be running. So from our code base perspective, what you're seeing there is for a team to have that and implement that in the application in the way that we want them to. There's as long as they've included the kind of import statement, if you like, they brought in the rules for the design system. It's a one-line piece of styling code where it says kind of @ for extend warning button. That's as simple as it gets, or that's as complex as it gets at an implementation level. And the design system does all the work underneath of defining the background color there, what the shadow should look like, what the size of the text is, what the color of the text is, what the behavior is when you mouse over and when you click it, etc., etc. So what we're trying to do is, if you like, we try to wrap up a whole set of behaviors in one very self-contained implementation interface.
Okay, we've got Sorry, Pete, we've got a couple of people sending their email addresses to you, so we have received those, and I will pass those on to Pete. So
okay, thank you.
Answer those questions. But we've had an additional question, which is, what challenges did you face with having to educate stakeholders to this alternative way of working while simultaneously implementing it? Wow, great question.
Yes, very good question. I mean, it could take me half an hour to answer this. I think, first and foremost, as I said, this is a 150-year-old business. It's at its core, this business operates on relationships. We make our money because of the relationships we have between all parties involved within the marine industry. So essentially, somebody who's looking to move a cargo from one part of the world to another, as we would call them charterers, to somebody who has a ship who has the capacity to do that. We bridge that kind of gap. So when an awful lot of the business has been based on the relationship you have with all of those parties, and long-standing business relationships, to begin to bring in technology into an environment that is, maybe potentially questioning why it needs to be there at all. You're not only fighting a need to kind of evolve and change, but actually also individuals who are, potentially not even ready for that transformation or not even sure what that looks like. So, you know, you're going into scenarios and you're going into, you know, meetings and presentations with individuals who are expecting to drive what things are. They're the ones making the demands on the business and demands on the features of the applications are there. And we want to change up how that process works. So a good example would be, typically the business had got used to coming to us with solutions rather than requirements. So they would perceive the need for a feature in their application that's going to do something. And not only would they say, we need the application to do this, they would also say, and we want it to work this way. We want this application to have a great big huge red button in the middle of the screen that when I click does this. And the challenge that we were facing is that, well, that's not particularly consistent for whatever reason. You know, perhaps in this example, the red button isn't appropriate because it's semantically implying something that is incorrect. Or perhaps actually what they're asking for is a feature which is very different to something else in another application. And therefore, the best solution for the platform overall is to be consistent. You know, in the same way I mentioned earlier, Excel and Word are similar products. You know, you open a file in the same way. It was very typical for the business historically to come to us with the same requirements, but ask for it in very, very different ways. So telling one party that they potentially couldn't have it the way they wanted is going to be difficult because they perhaps don't have an understanding of why it's been implemented in a particular way somewhere else, or why that's a better option. Does that make sense?
That's fantastic. Just so you know, Pete, we've got some questions coming in about showing previous slides. I just want to reinforce that we will be sending out the recording, including Pete's slides after. So please don't fret about that one. You will receive it.
Yeah, and I'm happy to kind of put it up on SlideShare or something like that if people want the actual deck as well.
Okay, fantastic. Do just please get in contact. Okay, next question is about, how do you design systems that are easier for your team?
I think that the key to any design system actually is to realize that they're never finished. You know, whilst we have Mark II of our product now, and it's much more seamlessly integrated into our products and our kind of build life cycles, it can and will improve. New requirements will be added. So it's for me, this is about kind of like trying to kind of bridge that area that I mentioned midway through my slides, and the kind of concept of design ops, and that if we want the products that we're designing to actually as closely resemble what we intend at the point of implementation, the point of hitting production, and especially where we're faced with the challenges like that we have here, where there's this huge spread of technology being implemented, it's about removing the opinion of the system as much as possible. It's actually just break it down to its core properties. It's just about defining what things look like, defining how things behave, and exposing that in the simplest way we possibly can. And I think that's where our kind of this concept we have of this API, if you like, is a paradigm that we're finding engineers are enjoying implementing because it's something they're used to. So it's addressing who are the who are the consumers of that design system, and the more work you can do to expose it in a way that they are comfortable with and familiar with, the more likely they are to implement it, and the more motivated they are to to kind of go that extra mile to ensure work is undertaken to match the designs as closely as possible.
Fantastic. Keep these questions coming in, guys. They're excellent. Next question for you, Pete. How long did it take for you to realise that there was a problem in the first place?
I think when I look back now, I think we knew within 3 months, but it took us a year to do anything about it. And I think that's a combination of stubbornly trying to push through, and just address things as we went. But actually also getting to a point where with 1 or 2 of the products, things were getting too complex, even for the person who had this design system in their head, to keep on top of what was going on. And doing as we often do when we get to the end of a year, just having a bit of a retrospective and an honest look back, and going, this isn't working. And knowing that the teams were going to continue to expand, just realizing that things are going to go bang in a big way if we don't sort this out.
I think the next question sort of follows directly from that. Do you think you are there, in quotations, and what are your next steps?
I don't think the design system will ever be there, be finished. I think we're a lot closer to a what I would call a fully mature system that's able to evolve seamlessly. I think the next steps for us, the problem that we have to address next is not all teams are necessarily always completely in sync with the latest version, if you like. So we are, we're releasing kind of small updates and tweaks to the design system on a kind of weekly basis. What I will call kind of patch releases. That's kind of very often small tweaks to the documentation and things like that. But at a kind of major version basis, that's kind of happening every month. And not all products are necessarily in a development life cycle which allows them to completely keep up with the latest version. And naturally also there's a hesitancy with the product owners to always trust that the latest version isn't going to have breaking changes and things like that in it. So kind of my focus and the design team's focus over the next 3 months is to stabilize that and also get a roadmap in place which kind of documents the upcoming features that we'll be adding and what the release cycle for those things will be. So if you like, actually getting the design system to a point where actually it's considered a product in its own right. It's just one which isn't necessarily public facing, it's just a product that the design teams use to implement within their own release cycles.
Pete, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Okay.
We've got one here about the current projects you're working on at sea.
Yep. Okay. If I go back, let me go back a few slides to show you just some of the applications we're working on. There's 6 applications listed there, but we have over a dozen products currently in development and a roadmap of several more in the kind of coming months and years, all centered effectively around covering the entire sector. So CNET is the vessel tracking product that I've mentioned a couple of times. Essentially, we are logging the position of every vessel in the world at 6-minute increments, tracking where they are, where they're going, the speed, etc. And then using that to make all sorts of various different calculations, which are surfaced into different applications. We have our own chat application tool, At the moment, the industry relies quite heavily on things like WhatsApp and Skype. Increasingly, we're falling a little bit in line with the finance sector, so kind of compliance and regulatory rules are beginning to kick in. So there is a need for the industry to adopt a kind of an accepted and kind of legally compliant chat protocol. And so C-chat is our attempt at that. Contracts that we list there is effectively a contract tracking tool. When a deal is done, what we call a charter party or a contract is put in place, and we have a web tool for the monitoring of revisions and changes across those contracts, and also for digitally signing those agreements. C-Share is a Dropbox style platform. It's essentially for the distribution of any documentation around different pieces of business. So if perhaps we're brokering a deal to sell a fleet of vessels to somebody, we will have a document store that has historical history logs on those documents, blueprints, etc. Gateway is a tool which effectively surfaces the kind of ongoing KPI monitoring of any project or any kind of piece of business that's ongoing. So that's a way for what we call charterers, or those people who've booked a vessel, to see where the vessel is that they've booked and how likely it is to make their destination in time. So think of that almost as kind of like on your Uber application, you sat in a taxi, it's showing you where you are and where you're headed. It's very much like that. Look, that's just 5 of the dozen or so applications we have. So they cover a real broad spectrum of business requirements and cases.
Okay, Pete, I know I said only a couple of questions, but they're coming in thick and fast, so maybe we can keep the answers quite short.
Okay. I'm happy to keep going though. I don't mind. So. Okay,
great. Are you still using Angular and React for your projects? What is your preference and why?
The short answer is yes, we are, and I don't actually ever see us standardising the framework overall. I think the only kind of general direction we've taken is that while some applications have been built with Aurelia, generally new applications moving forward will be built just in Angular or React. I have no personal preference over either of those. I think actually it's quite positive that we're able to allow teams to make the decisions that they see fit for their projects.
Okay. This next question is quite a long one.
Okay.
Were there applications that would have needed a significant redesign to allow to the new standards? If so, how did you manage implementing new designs when it may potentially conflict with the previous design in that application? Do you want me to repeat that, or is that okay for you?
No, I think that makes sense. And there's a short answer and a long answer to that. And the short answer is it really isn't easy when you're working with a product that has an established user base. When you've got a brand new product that's complex and is new, it's much easier to kind of define how things should behave. When you've got a legacy product that perhaps does a particular process in a way which contravenes how we would do something with the design system, we have 2 choices really. One is to try and persuade the user base that drastic change overnight is good, i.e. ripping the band-aid off. And unsurprisingly, most people within the business are resistant to that. But that's not to say it's impossible. The only real way to do that, and we've done this in a few places, which is where you chip away over a number of months and you project the path between where you are now and where the feature needs to get, and you plot a route and a journey as to how you can change those features incrementally over time. And that does sometimes mean a little bit of a compromise in the design system, and that takes planning and engineering. But it's not an impossible task. It just takes time.
Okay, fantastic. So the next question being, can you expand more on the C chat? Are you using an AI implementation?
Yes. So the actual delivery of the chat messages and things like that is done through a third party. But the C chat application essentially works in two ways. It's a kind of desktop style application in the same way, WhatsApp desktop or Skype might work. Works in the browser as well, and it allows our traders to talk directly on an individual level with third parties, with other principals, with clients, owners and charterers. It also allows for kind of group communication, so very similar to kind of WhatsApp groups, but it does so in a way where we're able to track who's seen what messages, and there's an audit trail of kind of what's going on. So should there ever be any need for kind of a compliance perspective, that information kind of is there. There's a mobile application as well. But one of the core strengths to our C chat product is that, as well as running a standalone applications, we are able to embed chat conversations in any of our applications. So within the contract application, for example, we're able to embed a threaded chat specifically around the contract in question, and it keeps it contextualized. So noise from other conversations elsewhere are pushed back.
Okay, fantastic. How much of this approach is a result of having a deep understanding of the development life cycle, i.e. knowing developers' pain points and therefore being able to give them what they require?
A not insignificant amount of that. Whilst my background is very much creative, and I too many years ago graduated from art school. I do also kind of sit on that kind of in that space where I kind of understand the engineering side of things as well. And in the past here have worked, on the development of, products, putting together JavaScript and styles and stuff like that. And a good portion of the SAS code behind our design system as it sits now is mine. So I think an understanding of what it means for an engineer to have to kind of implement designs and how kind of how time consuming that can be does mean that if I'm able to help engineer something which just gives them what they need in the way that they need it, and then we'll do the heavy lifting of making sure that does what it has to do in the background, then the product is can only be in a better place.
Excellent. I think that's the last question, really. Pete, can you
good.
your last slide so that people can get into contact? I know we've had some great questions, and I'm sure the conversation will continue from here. Just a last point from me about if people are wanting to get into touch with Pete or the C team about potentially coming to working on some of the projects, please do feel free to reach out to Pete. After this, we will be sending the recording with some call to actions of where you can find more information. But please do stay in contact with Pete. Pete, do you have any final?
Yeah, look, I think just there's, as I said, that last slide there has all my details. There's also the C Twitter channel, which is relatively quiet at the moment, in the sense that, like, I think it only went live last week and we haven't actually tweeted anything, but we will very shortly be launching a careers portal. which will detail a little bit more about kind of everything that's going on the roles and stuff that we have. So if anything I've kind of said today kind of piques your interest and you like the idea about coming and working on these products, then keep your eye on C_Live_ Twitter channel, and as soon as that careers portal is live, we will publicize it on there, and you can check out what we've got on offer.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you for listening, everyone.